Hello there, and welcome to Nutrient Nirvana History, Health, and Wellbeing channel. I've changed the name, you may have noticed. Um, Today, I'm joined once again by the thinking man's favourite historian, Ralph Ellis. How are you, Ralph?
Great to be with you again, Paul. Yes, doing well. Very busy this week with lectures and talks.
Glad to hear it. Brilliant stuff. Right. Okay, so we've had some exceptional questions. I've got to be honest. Thank you so much to everyone that sent in their questions. They really are of a very high standard. So, if you're ready, Ralph, let's get cracking, shall we?
I'm ready as I'll ever be. So yeah, let's see what they're asking today.
Brilliant. Okay. So, the first question we're going to start with today comes from Sam Dooley. Thank you, Sam. And actually, there's two questions here, really. The first one is, why is modern astrology based on inaccurate dates?
hmm
And if you want the second one, I'll give it to you now. How were the pyramids built? And was K2 built the same way?
Okay, yeah, two very different questions, so we can separate those out. The first one is about astrology, about how up to date it is, and it's completely and utterly out of date. Sorry for anyone that believes in their astrological signs, but you're following the wrong sign.
Wow.
Everyone in the world is following the wrong sign. The problem is that astrologers have not updated their charts since the time of Jesus. Probably, I think, with the material I've worked on, because the Saul Josephus character had not been initiated into astrology and the zodiac, and so he knew nothing about it, and so made it sort of taboo. And they lost the knowledge of procession at that point. Because remember, these Nazarene Jews had zodiacs on the floor of most of their synagogues. We've talked about these. But of course, within Christianity, they don't really know much about astrology, and they lost the knowledge. So the star charts have not been updated for 2,000 years. And the precession of the equinox drifts by 72 years every degree. So over 2,000 years, they've nearly gone a full month, a month being 30 degrees of the zodiac. They've nearly gone a full month out of date.
Wow.
So within astrology, they look at the vernal equinox between Aries and Pisces. Well, that's how it was at the time of Jesus. But of course, now it's actually approaching Aquarius. And the effect of that is that if you're um, Piscean within astrology, you are actually Aquarian. And if you're Aquarian, you are actually in Capricorn. And the Capricornians are actually within real astronomy. So all of these signs of the zodiac are completely out of date.
That's fascinating. Why isn't this generally accepted then? I mean, why has that not been amended at any point, do you think?
Yeah, you have to wonder, because modern astrologers do know that their star charts are completely out of date, but they still use the old ones as if they are, I don't know, old treasured relics or something. But I mean, they should have been up. If anyone truly believes in astrology, they should have been updating their star charts every century,
Mm.
because the stars will have moved by a degree and a bit every century, and they haven't. So completely out of date, I'm afraid. So
That's
it rather
amazing.
nullifies all of the predictions they make based on your astrological sign, because
Yeah.
that's not your astrological sign.
Well, I won't be reading Marjorie Proops in the Daily Mirror anymore if that's the
No, definitely
right.
not.
Okay. And the second question, how were the pyramids built and was K2 built the same way?
Yeah, we've not talked about this, have we?
No.
So this comes from my book K2 Quest of the Gods. Um, and we have a symmetry between the mountain known as K2 and the Great Pyramid. They look the same. So there is a pyramid up in the Himalaya, a rather large one. It's about 10 times the size of the Great Pyramid, up in the high Himalaya. It's the second highest mountain in the world. But it happens to be a square-sided pyramid aligned with the cardinal points. So it faces, north, east, south, and west with the various faces. And it has a causeway coming out of the bottom of it, angled at 14 degrees, which is exactly the same as the Great Pyramid has. So this was in my book, K2 Quest of the Gods, and I have to say it's all very speculative because we just don't have the information. There is no history on it. But the way I found it was interesting because inside the Great Pyramid, we have shaft angles that may give us latitudes and longitudes. Complete speculation, but anyway, so I drew the latitudes and longitudes on a map, and they pointed at K2.
Wow.
And K2 happens to be a copy of the Great Pyramid. So it's almost as if someone has copied what K2 looks like in order to make the Great Pyramid. Because remember that the Great Pyramid used to be all white when it was first made.
Hmm.
And of course, K2 is an all white pyramid because it's so high up in the Himalaya, it's always covered in snow.
This is incredible. So if this is the case, Ralph, is there any more sort of any other possibilities of other what we would consider to be natural mountains like K2 actually being something else?
Possibly. I mean, I started looking at this because I think we looked at Avebury before, didn't we, in one of our
Yes.
chats?
Yeah.
And Avebury looks like the Earth, as if the ancients were copying the form and shape of the Earth. Very interesting talk. Go and have a look at that on the Nutrient Nirvana site somewhere. Must be in one of those videos. And so, yeah, we have possibilities of the ancients copying natural shapes and forms. And so now we have the Giza Plateau sort of copying natural shapes and forms from up in the Himalaya. But that means that the pyramids can have a dual role, which is quite possible. There's no reason why not, because as we know, the Giza pyramids mimic the belt of Orion, as above, so below. So they're copying the layout of the stars in the constellation of Orion, but also they may well be copying mountains. And that might explain something like why some of the pyramids on Giza have a little bit of granite and then all Jura white limestone. So looking at the three pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramid is all white. It's all covered in snow. If you come down the mountain range a little bit and come to the second pyramid, it's mostly all white, but the bottom two courses are made of granite. They're dark, they're rocky. It's a mountain that's slightly lower where the snow line is not all the way down to the bottom. It's got a little bit of rock at the bottom of it. And then you go to the third pyramid, which is even smaller. It's further down the mountain range. It only has snow on the top of it. And the rest of it is all granite. A third of the third pyramid is granite at the base. So the pyramids might be mimicking mountains in a mountain range as well. Again, all very speculative, but it sort of all matches up. So I wrote about it, and readers can make up their own minds, basically.
It's absolutely fascinating. I've just started actually to read this one.
Yes.
Because I've read the Jesus books, the 4-part trilogy, which were amazing. So I've gone to your first book. Now I'm going to speed through that to get to the second one. I thought that's absolutely fascinating. And I must confess, it does remind me a little bit of some of the things that are featured within the Tartarian theory. I apologize for that. But they often talk about extremely old mountains or rock formations or whatever being kind of petrified fossils and things like that. Would you go along with that at all in any way?
Well, I don't follow the Tartarian theory, but if they're talking about ancient civilizations up in the Himalaya sort of thing,
Hmm.
in a way, I sort of do mention that because I follow the expedition of Alexander the Great and also of Bacchus. And Bacchus also goes up into, as it were, the Himalaya. And what is Bacchus doing up in the Himalaya? He's shaping mountains and things of this nature.
Hmm.
And he uses, I don't know, ivy or something for some strange reason. And he can cut rocks with ivy. And this is the story of Bacchus up in northern India somewhere, up in the Himalaya. So there are stories from Greece and from other regions of things happening up in the Himalaya. Um, but what they were doing, we don't really know. It's all very mythical and strange.
Hmm. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks for that, Ralph, and thank you, Sam. That's a great questions. Really good
Mm.
questions. All right, number two. We've got a question from Lisa of Craftomatic.
Ah, yes.
Thank you, Lisa. And she has said or asked, will you be doing any further research on the Scottish connection as a way of continuing the history of Queen Scota and bringing that history as close to the current day as possible?
Yeah, I've not really looked at the Queen Scota work for quite some time. I'm doing actually a lecture on it day after tomorrow. I sort of run out of material. There's only so much material within Scotti Chronicon. So the ancient book we're looking at is called Scotti Chronicon, which comes from Walter Boer and John Fordun. And they go back to the 13th and 14th centuries. So this history goes back a long way, and it also comes from the Labor Gabala, which is the ancient history of the Irish. And that's 6th century, so that goes back even further. But there's limited information on what you can find about these particular events. So what I need is more information somewhere, another text that I haven't read yet that I can follow through. So no, I've not really touched that for quite some time, which is a bit of a shame because it's an interesting story, really, that the Scottish and Irish people came out of Egypt on a big exodus, an exodus by the Amarna pharaohs, not of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but of the next pharaoh down, who was Pharaoh I and Ankhesenamun. And they were also thrown out of Egypt and sailed over to the west in 60 ships. And so Scotti Chronicon is the book that details where they went to. So it's a very interesting story, but I've run out of data and I
Mm,
need some more data on that.
yeah. Many years ago, I think I've mentioned this to you before, Ralph. I read a book by one Conor McDarry,
Mm,
Irish Wisdom Preserved in the Bible and the Pyramids. And he very much intimates that the Irish were the first civilization before the Egyptians or Babylon or anything like that.
mm,
And they went around, they were the first civilization to travel around the world, spreading knowledge, science,
mm.
philosophy, the arts, religion, whatever, etc. And obviously, you say it's the opposite of that.
The opposite, yes.
Yeah. Now,
Mainly because, I mean, there are no megaliths in Ireland. So the true megaliths, not the small ones like you find in Dublin at Newgrange, but
yeah,
there are no true megaliths. And really, I think for the origins of these histories and peoples, you really need to find a megalithic site.
yeah, it's a very
So
interesting point. Yeah,
yeah, so you don't find them in Ireland, but of course you do in the Levant and Egypt. You find lots of the biggest megaliths in the world almost there. And I think they came out of Egypt and populated Ireland and Scotland. And remember, this would have been at a very, very early date, a prehistoric date, because they would have been landing in Ireland circa 3,000 years ago. That's before recorded history within Ireland, so you would have no idea where the original Irish and Scottish came from, because it's so much earlier than recorded history in those lands.
Yeah, he also talks about the etymology of a lot of words, and he's a strong advocate for a lot of words in all sorts of languages coming from the Irish language or the Gaelic language from thousands of years ago. So it's a very interesting book to read anyway. It's a bit of a cult classic, if you like. I think it was written over 100 years ago now.
Oh, is it? Because there's been more recent people who have followed on with the same sort of arguments.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure it was written in the very early 20th century. Okay, brilliant. Right, so that was Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for that question. Now, question number 3. This is interesting. This comes from Justin DeArmond. And Justin was very crafty. He managed to sneak about 27 questions into one paragraph here. So yeah, hold on to your hats, everyone. So, Ralph, why did Alexander the Great travel to K2? What is special about the location? Is there a hall of records there? Where did Alexander get his information from? And does this tie into the Jesus story at all?
Yeah, well, we've just briefly touched on this, of course, with the other question. Yeah, this comes from my book, K2 Quest of the Gods again. And we're looking at the history of Alexander the Great and how this might tie in to my observations about K2. And Alexander just has a very strange story, which is not explained by classical history at all. So he was a Macedonian leader. He went down to the Levant and he squashed the Persian army up by modern Antioch in the sort of northwest corner of the Mediterranean there. And then he left them alone for some reason. I mean, the logical thing would be to chase them because they were retreating. Wouldn't you try and chase them and defeat the rest of that army? Instead, he goes down to Egypt instead. And to become Pharaoh of Egypt. And I think that this might be something to do with the history of the Greeks, because I keep finding little bits of information that indicate that the Greeks came from Egypt in many of these Exodus events that have come out of Egypt. We have the story of Danas coming out of Egypt and going to Argos, which is Greece, basically Macedonia. Danas, I think, was Pharaoh I. Again, we were talking about Queen Scota, the same sort of story. He went to Greece before he ended up going to Ireland and Scotland. So there were links between Egypt and Greece in the pre-Greek period. I mean, this is before Greece had even arrived on the scene. So that, again, this would have been 1300 BC, long before Greece was a significant civilization. And they may have seeded a lot of what was going on in Greece. And of course, if later kings of Greece had understood that history, then yes, maybe they wanted to go down into Egypt because that's where they came from, and maybe to be initiated into the secrets of the Egyptians. And that's exactly what Alexander did. He went down to Egypt, he became Pharaoh of Egypt, and then he went out to Siwa, the sacred oasis in the Western Desert, and at great risk to himself and so on, and his army and whatever, he went across to Siwa to be initiated into the secret rites of Egypt. And then he came back and he went back through the Levant, charged across Iraq, modern Iraq and Iran, defeated Darius again in 2 battles, I think, with the famous one at, oh gosh, it's just escaped my memory for a minute. But anyway, at the capital of Persia at that stage. And then chased Darius, because he escaped, chased him up into Afghanistan. So up through modern Pakistan and up through Afghanistan into Alexander the Furthermost, which is way up in the sort of north of the Himalaya, in the most inhospitable spot in the whole world almost, with his army and all of its baggage train. He's got the army itself is like a minimum of 30,000 people. And then you add on all of the camp followers and the baggage train and everything else. He's probably got 50,000 people up in the Himalaya for no good reason. And the question is, why on earth was he up there? Was he really chasing Darius III still, who was just on his own by that time? He didn't have an army. It was just Darius and a couple of retainers, and that was about it. And when you read Arrian, who gives the biography of Alexander, he's up in the Himalaya looking for sacred mountains, sort of thing. And what's that all about? Nobody can explain it. And again, it's linked with this story of Bacchus, who's also up in the mountains, shaping mountains up in the Himalaya for no good reason. There are lots of strange tales about goings on in that sort of region. And it just so happened that when I did my expedition looking into the design of the Great Pyramid, that was pointing in the same direction. And of course, as we've said before, K2 is very similar to the Great Pyramid. It's a copy of the Great Pyramid, or vice versa. Actually, the Great Pyramid is a copy of K2. So was he on the trail of the same mythology? I don't know. But I write about it because it's interesting and people can make up their own minds. So again, yes, just read it and see what you think. It's just funny that all of these coincidences drop out of the history, because no one else can explain why Alexander was sitting there running around in the Himalaya for no good reason.
Yes, that's really interesting, and that's
I mean,
opened up.
just for instance, I went up to Skardu, which is up in the Himalaya. It's actually in Pakistan rather than being Afghanistan. So Alexander went up to Skardu. That's why it's called that name, Skardu, as in Alexandra. And so it's the town is still called Skardu. Well, who on earth would want to go up to Skardu? I mean, there's a road that goes sort of within a few hundred kilometers of Skardu. And from there, you have to take the mountain road. Now, obviously, it was a modern road built by the Chinese in the 1980s. Before that, there was no road. There was a goat track that went like 200 kilometers up towards Skardu. And it's just utterly impenetrable. The modern road that they created that goes up to Skardu, I think had 1,000 hairpin bends between the Green Man, as it were, which was a big mountain down the bottom, and getting up to Skardu. And this poor old taxi driver that was going round and round. It took 2 days. It took 2 days to get to Skardu from the base of the mountain gorge, with obviously with an overnight stop, and then the next day continually going all day. I mean, these were 10-hour days going round and round these hairpin bends. On the way back, I flew back, and the flight was 20 minutes. That's how close it is. But that's how impenetrable it is, even today. So you can imagine when it was a goat track and no road, to take, okay, they didn't take the whole army up there, but to take an advance party up to Skardu was utterly insane. Why on earth would you even try? But he did.
Ralph, how are you spelling Skardu?
I don't know, actually. Skardu, I think, Skardu, up in northern Pakistan.
Brilliant.
It sort of has an...
Sorry, there was, I reckon about 10 years ago or so now, there was a story that broke out on the internet regarding a sphinx that's been discovered in Romania,
Okay.
somewhere in the country, and allegedly the authorities managed to break into this sphinx and find a hall of records, and there was all sorts of holographic information and different things going. I know the more you got into that idea or whatever, the more silly it got. But I've seen pictures of this sphinx in Romania, and it does look interesting. Does look very interesting. So maybe that's something that you could have a look at in the future.
Yeah, I look at these things. Unfortunately, when they start to get a little bit woo-woo, you know it might well be an invention.
It could be,
But
or it could be that they have found something, but they make it sound a lot more dramatic to put people off the scent, or who
possibly.
knows? Who knows?
There's a lot of people out there that unfortunately are sort of fakers, and they will do things for money or fame. I don't know what, but they rather spoil it for everybody else
I know
because,
that hoaxes is
yeah, these little hoaxes. There was a
yeah.
lady in Egypt, and she's supposed to be well known, and she's got books and she does talks. And she was taken in by an Egyptian tomb up in Turkey or something. And it was, the tomb of a pharaoh in Turkey. And this video came out of it and so on. And it was pretty obvious that this was it
I
was a
think I
movie
saw that.
set. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a
yeah.
movie set. So it was either in Hollywood or it was somewhere else like that. I mean, we have one down in the south of Britain somewhere, which it's on one of the major estates. And because the guy went to Egypt quite a lot, they made a copy of the tomb of Tutankhamun there. And so you could go to that particular place and shoot that. And you could say, hold on, that's the tomb of Tutankhamun in the south of Britain. But of course, it's just a stage set, it's not real. But they were trying to put this out as being something real, and it's a bit of a shame because it's quite obvious that it wasn't.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Let's move on to the next question. This one's coming from Name. So you'll have to work on that name. Okay, let me make sure I've got my teeth in straight for this one. Can you shed any light on Melchizedek, the
Melchizedek.
priest of the Most High? If I remember rightly, he's in Genesis, or I might be getting him mixed up with Phil Collins, possibly. I don't know.
Yes. Yes.
Did he play the
He
drums?
Melchizedek. Yeah, I don't know why people like this guy so much, and I think the quote from Adam Clarke, I think, is the best on this. So Adam Clarke is this theologian from the 19th century who wrote the concordance on the Bible, and his observations are just brilliant sometimes. And he says of Melchizedek, because Melchizedek only has one verse in Genesis, I think it is, and one in Psalms, I think, and that's it. He's got two verses in the whole of the Old Testament. And so Adam Clarke says, 1,000 idle stories have been told about this man, and 1,000 idle conjectures spent on the subject of his short history. He's of complete insignificance. The only reason he came to prominence is because the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, says that Jesus was a similitude of Melchizedek. So there is a link between Melchizedek and Jesus, and that's why people keep talking about him. And the reason for that similitude, or the claimed similitude, is that Jesus did become high priest, but he wasn't allowed to because he wasn't a Levite. So how did he become a Cohen, a high priest? And so they had to make an excuse for him. So in Hebrews 7, it says, well, Well, Melchizedek became a high priest, and he wasn't a Levite, and therefore you must be able to become a high priest. And then they have this secondary excuse that he was elected, and therefore an election is much better than inheritance. And so that's why he becomes important. I think he was covering up the fact that the Talmud says that Jesus became high priest because his wife bought him the high priesthood with a takub of silver. This is going back into the story of Mary and Martha Bothus, who married Jesus of Gamala. And of course, well, you could regard that as being separate from the gospel story, but it seems quite obvious to myself. And Professor Robert Eisenman did a long couple of chapters on this, saying that this Mary Bothus was Mary Magdalene. The Mary and Martha were the Bethany sisters.
Yeah, I was reading the Gospel of John fairly recently, and I think the rising of Lazarus is in the Gospel of John. And Jesus went to Lazarus and met with Mary and Martha, who
Yes.
were they the sisters of Lazarus? I think it's intimated in the Gospel that's the case.
Yes, I think, yeah.
And Jesus was clearly very, very friendly with this family, very
Oh,
friendly, very
yes, yeah.
intimately. So,
Well,
so yeah,
the Mary there is Mary Magdalene.
yeah,
So
yeah,
within the Catholic Church, and even really, if you read the Gospels, it's pretty obvious that Mary of Bethany, was Mary Magdalene. And
yeah.
of course, the Bethany sisters lived at the house of Simon. And of course, Bothus was called Simon Bothus. So they were both called Simon. So there's lots of reasons for thinking that Mary Bothus was Mary Magdalene, and therefore she would have married the biblical Jesus, because the Talmud says that Mary Bothus married Jesus of Gamala. So the reason they want to cover up the reason for Jesus becoming high priest is because he wasn't even elected. He bought his position with a takub of silver, or rather his wife did. It wasn't even him. It was Mary Magdalene that bought him the high priesthood. And he was only high priest for 2 years, I think. And this was in the, that's the other reason they want to cover it up. This was in the AD 60s, not the AD 20s. So there's a good reason for trying to cover this up.
Brilliant, fantastic answer. Right, okay, let's move on. Oh, sorry.
Just as one final little point, I had this argument with Richard Carrier a few years ago, and he said nowhere in the gospel say that Jesus became a high priest, and I was rather stunned by that. How does Richard Carrier not know that Jesus became a high priest in Hebrews 7? I don't know. Very strange.
Yeah,
anyway.
odd. Okay, next question comes in from Jeff Baker. And Jeff has asked, what is the true history of the Sphinx?
Yes. True history of the Sphinx. Well, we don't know the true history, but I tend to go along with the people who say it was built circa sort of 10,000 BC.
Is this because of the weathering that you see on the Sphinx?
Well, yes, sort of, but the trouble is with the weathering, you have nothing to compare it to. So you don't know the rate of weathering that would be normal in that region. I would prefer it if you could have, if you had a series of monuments, each 2,000 years older than the other, and you could see a pattern of wearing across these monuments, you could easily say, yes, that place is the Sphinx at 10,000 BC. But we don't have that. So the main reason for thinking it's older is that these people were obviously following the precession of the equinox. And the age of Leo is from about 12,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. That's the age of Leo, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, it's about that sort of age. So why would they build the Sphinx looking due east, which is how you do precession spotting, if it wasn't connected with the rising of Leo in the precession of the equinox? And that gives it a very specific date. So there's a very good reason for building the Sphinx if it will give you the exact era when it was built. I mean, there's a perfect reason for actually building it, because you want to preserve the history of the Giza Plateau. So I do think it was built at that time. The other oddity I found with it is the head. The head is of a different piece of rock. So it's level 3 within the strata, not level 1 and 2. It's a much, much harder stone. Now, this is natural. There were 3 layers within the Giza Plateau, but most of level 3 has all disappeared. It is like the only chunk of it that is left, and the rest of it is gone. What were the chances that that little hunk of rock was in the right place at the base of the pyramid just to make the Sphinx and carve it into the head of the Sphinx? It rather suggests that they dragged this piece of stone into the right place and then carved out the head and then carved out the body below it to get it into the right position. The only trouble with that is this must have been probably the biggest block ever moved. I mean, we marvel at the Baalbek stone, which are like 1,400 tons for the largest one. The head of the Sphinx, before it was carved, would have had to have been about 2,500 tons before they ended up carving it. I mean, that's just monstrous. That's huge. So if they dragged that into position so it was in the right place to be the head of the Sphinx, that was a monumental effort.
And how did they do that, Ralph?
Yes, well, one has to go a little bit esoteric with that,
Wow, it's just incredible, isn't it? Brilliant. Okay, where was we with that? That was from who asked that question?
Was that paper?
No.
No, name, wasn't it? Not paper.
Yeah, no. It was Jeff Baker. Of course, it was Jeff.
All right.
And Jeff has suddenly leaped 10,000 years into the future with this question: How many, and who of the German army or government survived World War II, and where did they go?
Yeah, that is a big jump, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's zoom into the 20th century. Yeah, as it happens, I know a little bit about this because I followed the events of the Second World War, and yeah, they escaped via Operation Paperclip, and Operation Paperclip was mainly organized by the Vatican. Okay, well that puts a twist on the story. why was the Vatican helping the Nazis escape? Because they cooperated with the Nazis all the way through the Second World War. Not once did I think it was Pope John the 12th, I think, not once did he criticize and condemn Hitler for what was going on in the Second World War. They say because he was doing the Catholic bidding in getting rid of the Jews, of course, which is exactly what the Catholic Church wanted. So, I mean, they were brothers in arms, you might say, the Catholic Church and Hitler. So anyway, apparently Operation Paperclip was organized mostly by the Catholic Church, and they all disappeared off down to Argentina, which is why you get these large Germanic communities down in Argentina, because that was another sort of fascist state that they could easily go to. And no extradition treaties, no doubt, so you're not going to get them out of there. Now, the other place, I mean, okay, we can condemn the Catholic Church in Argentina, but the West wasn't much better, really, because, of course, most of the aerospace scientists went out of Germany and they went to NASA, and they all worked for NASA. And they were busy creating the Apollo program. And the others who didn't get captured because we could only capture the ones in the West. The ones who were in the East and got captured by the Russians worked for the Russian space program. So there was always the little joke within the space community. The joke is, why did the Americans beat the Russians to the moon with the space program? And the answer is that the American Germans were better than the Russian Germans. It was a German space program on both sides, whether it was Russia or American. It was a German space program. They just moved. They went from Peenemünde, and they just went out to NASA.
So, what about a certain person whose initials are AH? Did they?
Oh, well.
I mean, I've got to say that there's a photograph of him supposedly dead, isn't there? And it to me, it resembles Charlie Chaplin more than it does AH.
Yeah,
so it looks very
by
fake.
the end, he was looking like Charlie Chaplin. He had taken so many drugs by the end. In fact, if you look at him, he's looking a bit like Putin now. I don't know if you've seen Putin, but recently, because he used to be a fit young guy, and suddenly, all of a sudden, he's got this big puffy face, and he's looking like he's on his last legs, just like Hitler was. Yeah. So yeah, no,
So
I don't think he escaped, but there we go.
So Hitler ended up looking like Keith Richards by the end of the Second World War.
Oh no, Keith Richards is the skinny one, isn't he?
He was the lead guitarist in the Stones. He must be pushing 80 now, and the amount of drugs that guy has done is just incredible, and he's still going strong. It's remarkable.
Well, precisely. No, I wasn't thinking of Keith Richards, or maybe I was. Who was the one that was in Pirates of the Caribbean?
Oh, Johnny Depp.
No. He was one of the old.
Keith Richards was in one of those.
That was Keith Richards. Yeah, yes. He was looking remarkably well, wasn't he?
Yeah.
As you say, for what they got up to in the 60s and 70s, he was looking remarkably well.
I was a bit hesitant about mentioning this to the viewers on this channel, but as we're talking about the Second World War, I saw a documentary about 5 or 10 years ago called The Greatest Story Never Told. I hope this isn't going to get me in trouble. I won't talk too much about it, but it certainly opened my eyes as to, what actually occurred during that war. And some of the stories that we've been told about it might not necessarily be true. As they say, the winners of war write history, don't they?
Always, yes, they always do. Yeah. Yes.
Let's move on quickly then. Right.
Well, just as an illustration of that, I think I've said this once before. Because I used to live in Russia for a while, in Moscow, and if you asked Russians about the Second World War, Russia was the only country who was fighting against Germany, and the West did nothing until they invaded during D-Day.
Well, Ralph, I heard that before the Germans carpet bombed East London, we'd already done that to 2 cities in Germany. It was retaliation.
Oh no, I don't think it was retaliation. I think they started it. No, we had dropped some bombs on some cities, but I don't think you could call it carpet bombing. It was just to prove, I suppose, that we could reach that far, because Germany thought the RAF would never get that far, and so some cities were bombed, but you couldn't call it carpet bombing. That started with the Blitz, but then we retaliated in kind and did it even more than they did, of course. The more interesting one was Dresden. But it's quite obvious from the history of Dresden, because that was condemned quite a lot for the burning of Dresden, which wasn't a military target, but it was wiped off the map for no good reason, so people say.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, Ralph, but supporters of the Tartarian theory will say that Dresden, in particular, some of these German cities were flattened to get rid of a lot of the Tartarian architecture.
Oh, no, I don't think that happened. No, the reason it happened, in my estimation, and there's lots of information to back this up, is it was done to prevent World War III. So it had nothing to do with World War II. It was to stop World War III. The big fear from America and Britain at the time is that Russia would steamroll across the whole of Europe,
Mm,
because they
mm,
had the army and the men, and they had the inclination to go and do it. And the
Well,
Russian army was like about 20 miles outside Dresden. And so on 2 nights, was it 2 nights or one night? They bombed Dresden, flattened Dresden to the ground, and like about 2 days later, the Russians entered Dresden, and they
mm,
could not believe the amount of destruction. And
mm,
so the message that was given at the time, a message was sent out to Stalin. You see Dresden, we can do the same to Moscow.
mm,
So stop at the Elbe or whatever the river was that was agreed where they're going to
mm.
stop. If you go beyond that agreed point, the same will happen to Moscow. And so it was in order to prevent World War III happening.
Who would you say, in your own opinion, based on your own research, who was the greatest threat to Europe at that time? Was it Hitler or was it Stalin?
Well, yes, I've said this before, did we pick the right side? Because we went to war to save Poland, but Poland had already been invaded by the Russians. They divided up Poland between them, between
Mm,
Germany and Russia. So, yeah, who were we saving Poland from?
mm,
Yes, it was a marriage of convenience, but I don't think it was. I
yeah.
suppose it was necessary because we couldn't fight Germany on our own, and therefore we needed someone else to go along with it. But yeah, they were
And it's also a
not a
shame.
very good ally.
It's also a shame that we're what 70 odd years now past the Second World War, and here am I talking to you about it, and I'm actually on tenterhooks talking about it, thinking I'm going to get a strike. I'm going to get a strike. I mean,
I know.
it's a
Yes,
crazy world, isn't it? We should be able to have this conversation. And
yes.
can I just suggest to viewers that they start researching and looking into this subject, because it's very, very interesting. And you may find, and I'll leave it here, but you may find that what you were told at school about the Second World War doesn't truly represent what was really going on at that time. It goes a lot deeper than that.
And
Um,
also that it's still ongoing at the same time. The invasion of Ukraine is really unfinished business of the Second World War in part.
mm,
So
mm.
these things do have knock-on effects
I've also heard,
for decades.
yeah, I've also heard that the Ukraine and Poland was formerly where the Khazars came from, and they are now making a play, if you like, i.e., the Rothschilds, to reclaim that land for themselves and make it a new Israel, if you like. I don't know
Hmm.
if you would go along with that at all. Is that a
I
possibility?
don't think there's enough of them to do that. There's very few Khazars left in that region. Of course, they were all deported, executed, or whatever, and most of them have already gone to Israel anyway. So I doubt if there's very many actually left in that region.
Yeah, fair point.
So yeah,
Okay, right, let's move on. Right, next question. This comes from, I'm going to struggle to pronounce this one right, Dashu 55CS. And they have asked, are the Jews the Egyptians? Why do the rabbis say otherwise? And what do the pyramids,
yeah.
hold on, what do the pyramids symbolize for Judaism? Oh, and there's a little bit more to that, but I will.
Well, even that second bit is a little bit separate, so we'll come to that. So the first thing is, were the Hyksos the Israelites? Yes, they were. Why do they cover it up? Don't know, actually. We'll have a look at that. But were the Hyksos the Israelites? Yes, because the Hyksos Exodus is identical to the Israelite Exodus. We've been through this before, so I won't again. They are identical in everything except date. So if you don't mind moving the date by 300 years, you will find the Israelite Exodus in the historical record. And they should know that the Hyksos with the Israelites, because Josephus Flavius says so. So what does he say by this? He says, such is Manetho's account. So he's talking about Manetho. He's recording the history by Manetho, who was a 3rd century BC Egyptian historian. And he says, such is Manetho's account. And if the years which he enumerates are summed up, it is clear that the so-called shepherds, our ancestors, left Egypt and settled in our country 393 years before Danas came to Argos. There's the Danas and Argos again we've been talking about. But he calls the so-called shepherds, the Hyksos, our ancestors. And then in another portion of the same book, he says, Manetho states that this race, the so-called shepherds, the Hyksos, were described as captives in the sacred books of his country. In this statement, he is correct, for sheep breeding was a hereditary custom of our remotest ancestors. And from this nomadic life, they came to be called shepherds. So in 2 or 3 sections within this book, he is calling the Hyksos shepherds our ancestors. It's perfectly clear that Josephus Flavius regarded the Israelites as being the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, the Hyksos shepherd kings. So yeah, they were one and the same people, and it's obvious to anyone who has read Josephus Flavius. So why do they not admit to it, even within Judaism? Yeah, I imagine because in olden times, many, many centuries ago, they had already regarded the Egyptians as being the evil Egyptians who were persecuting them, and they didn't want to be associated with the Egyptians. They probably had already adopted the persecution complex, which many people do, in order to keep your group, your society, your civilization as a cohesive whole. You say that we're the outgroup and we're being persecuted by those horrible people, those Egyptians. So if you've got this persecution complex, which is maintaining your society, it's very difficult to say that you were the Hyksos, who were the most powerful people in Egypt at the time, with the largest standing army in the world. It's difficult to say that we were the most powerful army in the world and we were being persecuted by those horrible Egyptians. It sort of doesn't work, does it? So I think that's probably the reason why in ancient times that they never said it. In modern times, it's difficult for them to say it again because it means that the homeland, the sacred homeland of the Israelites, is actually in northern Egypt, not Israel. So that undermines the whole reason for being in Israel. They only got to Israel circa after the Babylonian exile, so circa about 500 BC. I think they were resettled at that time because they were they were taken to Babylon, and they were let go from Babylon by Cyrus the Great. And I think they returned at that point to Israel. So they would have only populated Israel from about 500 BC. So the true homeland of the Israelites was the Nile Delta. Hence my book, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, where I say Solomon and David were also living in the Nile Delta. Well, that's tricky in the modern era to say, excuse me, we need to take over the Nile Delta. Can you please all evacuate from the Nile Delta? That will be the new state of Israel in the Nile Delta. It's not going to work. So I think for political reasons, nobody can admit this. because the history will undermine the current politics of the region.
That makes a lot of sense, definitely. Okay. The shoe goes on to ask a couple of things, but I'll just give you one at a time. What is your take on Jesus ben Pandera in the Talmud, or I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Toledot Yeshu?
Toledot Yeshu, yes, the
Yeah,
Toledot
yeah.
Yeshu. It's an apocryphal gospel from, I don't know, the 3rd or 4th century, probably. Yes, there is a lot of talk about the father of Jesus being it normally actually says Pandera. Lots of people translate that as being Pantera, and so they equate it with a Roman soldier who was called Panther, Pantera.
Yeah. Who's the lady that does the research on the chronological chasm? Lena Einhorn, isn't it, or something?
Lena Einhorn, yes.
This is the guy that she
Yes.
points to being, I think, Jesus' father, doesn't she? Or am I getting mixed up there?
Oh, does she? I didn't know that. But yes,
I
lots
could
of
be
people who have done
wrong,
that.
but I know that
No.
she mentions Jesus Pendara a lot.
Yeah. It comes from the Talmud, where they say Jesus was Ben Pandira, with a D, not a T. And it doesn't agree with what they say. So let's see what the Talmud says. This comes from Sanhedrin 67. And it says, before I start, the Talmud is very confusing, so you have to sort of go along with what it says. And he says, and this they did to Ben Stada in Lydda. They hung him on the eve of the Passover. Who was hung on the eve of the Passover? Okay, that was the Jesus guy. Ben Stada was Ben Pandira. So the son of Stada was the son of Pantera, the same person. Rabbi Hesida said the husband was Stada and the paramour was Pandira, a paramour being a lover. So the husband was Stada and the lover was Pandira. So the Ben person, the son of, is the son of Stada, the husband, and the son of Pandira, who was the lady, the lover. So in this case, it's saying that Ben Pandira, he was the son of his mother, not the father, which changes the story somewhat. Okay, so it goes on. But was not the husband Paphos ben Judah? So they're giving another name for this guy. They do have multiple names. Some people say you can only have one name, but it's quite clear from the Talmud that these people have multiple names. So Stada was also called Paphos. And I'm not sure where Paphos comes from. I don't know where that comes from. But his mother was called Miriam, the dresser of ladies' hair. We'll have a look at that in a minute. As they say in Pumbeditha, this woman has turned away from her husband, i.e., she has committed adultery. So all this is talking about Jesus, but talking about it in code, because the Talmudic rabbis were afraid of the Romans, and then they were afraid of the Christians, and so they wrote everything in code. So the bottom bit, it says, as they say in Pumbeditha. Pumbeditha was the big, you wouldn't call it a monastery. It was, anyway, a large synagogue, as it were, in Babylon. Because remember, the Jews used to rule. They ran most of Babylon for a long, long time. And one of the biggest religious centers for the Jews was in modern Iraq, in Babylon, right up until 1947, when they all got kicked out after the Second World War. And Pumbeditha was this major religious establishment down there. And so the woman who's turned away from her husband, That is Mary the Virgin. They're making fun of her because she didn't have sex with her husband, she had sex with God instead. So she was being an adulteress with God in order to have Jesus. They're making fun of the whole situation, basically. We know this is talking about this family because it says, but his mother was Miriam, Mary, the dresser of ladies' hair. Again, this is a play on words. And this is not a linguistic progression, as some people have said. You can't change this name to that name because there is no progression between the two. This is not linguistic progression. This is making a joke. And they don't seem to get the joke sometimes. So anyway, his mother was Miriam, the dresser of ladies' hair. In Hebrew, that phrase, because it doesn't mean anything in the English. In Hebrew, that phrase is Megdalala. Megadala Neshea. Or if you say it phonetically, it's Magdalene the Nazarene. So Miriam, the dresser of ladies' hair, is Miriam Magdalene Nazarene in the Hebrew, if you just say it phonetically and don't read it as being dresser of ladies' hair. So they're making a play on words with Mary Magdalene. Okay, so we know that this is talking about Mary Magdalene and Jesus. So for the Jesus character, his father was called Stada and his mother was called Pandira. But of course, you can see from the rest of this story that these are going to be pseudonyms. They're not real names. Now, Stada could mean, and this is not my translation, this comes from Robert Hereford. He's, again, an old Christian theologian from 1903. And he says that Stada connects with estadure, meaning seditious or revolutionary. So in that case, they would say that Jesus was the son of the revolutionary, which of course perfectly fits the biblical story. Jesus was locked up in prison alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. And he goes on to say, this suggests that it originally denoted the Egyptian who claimed to be a prophet and led his followers to the Mount of Olives, where he was routed by the procurator Felix, and that in later times he might have been confused with Jesus. Which is exactly what I say in my books, of course, and I hadn't read this until very recently. So here's Robert Hereford, an ancient theologian, 1903, it's fairly ancient, 100 years ago or more, who is making the same connection that I've made between Jesus and the Egyptian false prophet, because the word Ben Stada might mean the son of the revolutionary. There's other reasons for thinking this that he didn't mention. The Egyptian false prophet took the 5,000 out into the wilderness, of course. And who did that? Ah, yes, that was the Jesus character, of course, wasn't it? So, yes, I don't know whether we've explained that fully because we haven't fully explained who Pandira is. But unlike, because he was talking about the Toledoth Yeshu. In the Toledoth Yeshu, it's the father who's called Pandira, not the mother. But in the Talmud, it's the mother. But it really depends on what Pandira means. Maybe that pseudonym might work for the mother and father, but I don't know what that pseudonym is. a long, long time ago, Ahmed Ahman, who wrote Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, very good book if you can come across it, he was saying that Joseph from the Old Testament was Yuya, and Yuya was the patriarch of the Amarna family of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So that's a very interesting book, and I think he's probably right on that. But anyway, one of the other things he said is that Pandira was probably taken from the Egyptian Panatara, which means my god Ra. Panatera. Don't know if that's true. He presented evidence that he thought it might be true. So remember, these people came out of Egypt. They do have Egyptian names. Joseph had an Egyptian name, and various other people had Moses had an Egyptian name. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Pandira comes out of Egypt. But I've not seen a translation that links him up with Jesus being, hung on the eve of the Passover and all of that business. So don't know. Anyway, that's the explanation. And it sort of needs further research, one might say.
Yeah. How much is Jesus mentioned in the Talmud? How many times, for example?
Oh, at least a dozen times. Yeah.
Yeah. It would be
But
nice
he's always mentioned in terms of the Jewish revolt, and that's why they don't like him, because he's denigrated within the Talmud. They don't like him because they blame him for the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple during the Jewish revolt. But of course, that makes the Jesus character into a leader of the Jewish revolt, which is AD 60s, of course. And so they say terrible things about him, like Jesus should be boiled in semen and shit, because he destroyed the temple. He led the destruction of the temple. So, yeah, he is in the Talmud. And again, I had this argument with Richard Carrier, and he said, nowhere in the Talmud is Jesus mentioned. Sorry, Carrier. Yes, he is mentioned in the Talmud.
Yeah, he's a mythicist, isn't he, Ralph? He's a mythicist.
Yeah, he's a mythicist, but I would have thought he would have read the Talmud before commenting on the Gospels, because it's pretty obvious that these characters are discussed within the Talmud. And that rather knocks mythicism on the head completely. Because why would the Talmudic rabbis be mentioning the Jesus character if he was mythical? It would be like the Catholic Church obsessing about Robin Hood, You don't worry about a mythical character. You only worry about this guy because he was a leader of the Jewish revolt. So, yeah, I think that destroys the mythicist argument.
It would be great if somebody could collate all these Jesus stories in the Talmud into one place. That would be really good. So
I've got most of them in my King Jesus book. So that's the book before Jesus, King of Edessa, and I go through most of the Talmudic text and look at these Jesus quotes. Because remember, it's not me that's saying that this is Jesus within the Talmud. I mean, sometimes he is called Yeshu the Nazarene. Okay, well, if he's called Yeshu the Nazarene, then we know that is Jesus. But when he's called Ben Stada or Ben Pandira, it's not quite so clear that this is Jesus, and you have to tease it out. But I'm not the first character to actually say that, Ben Stada was Jesus. Most of these translations have been done by, Christian and Judaic scholars decades and centuries ago. And I'm just picking up on what they say, and I'm adding my own little spin to those discussions. So, yeah, lots of people have found Jesus in the Talmud in many places.
Okay. Dashu, who asked that question, has gone on to say, Saul Josephus was an Edessan ambassador. It is written that he never met Jesus. Could you tell us about their relative movements through the decades? For example, Jesus was at school in Alexandria, while Saul Josephus was growing up in Tarsus?
Yeah, under my chronology, they would not have been at the same time in that era, because the Jesus character would have been born in the early 1st century, according to the standard chronology. The Saul character in my chronology was not born until AD 37. So Saul would have had no chance of meeting with the biblical Jesus until he was a man, which would have occurred in AD 51. So that would be the earliest he could really ever see the biblical Jesus, because I have Saul being born much later than classical Christianity will allow. But I think I'm sort of right, because if you remember when Saul was at the stoning of Stephen, Saul was described as a young man. But most people, Robert Eisman included and various others, say that the stoning of Stephen was the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. And that probably happened in AD 62. Now, under the classical interpretation, Saul could not be a young man in AD 62, because most people say he was born in AD 10 or something, So he'd have been quite old by that time, middle-aged at the very least. Under my chronology, that actually works quite well, because Saul would have been 25 years old at that time. He was still a young man. So why did Saul not meet Jesus? Well, it may well be that during his epistles, he had never met Jesus at that time. So when he was writing all of the epistles within the Gospels, he would not be mentioning Jesus as someone he had met, which he doesn't. He never says that he met the Jesus character. Now, of course, in classical chronology, they'll say, oh, well, he couldn't meet Jesus at that time because the Jesus character was supposed to be dead. But in my chronology, he was alive and well, but they had never met because he was out across the Mediterranean and Jesus was elsewhere. So he had never met the biblical Jesus. The first time he would have met him, possibly, well, almost definitely, was when he came back to Judea from Rome after he had been to see Nero and come back again. And he was made into the army commander in command of Galilee, working for the Judean authorities. And at that time, he was persecuting a guy called Jesus all across Galilee. This was the Jesus of Gamala character. And he was persecuting him all across Galilee. This would have been in AD 66, something of that time. So that would be the first time he actually saw this character. And why didn't he write about it? Well, he does in a way, because in Acts of the Apostles, he has the Jesus character saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Okay, in the classical interpretation, that doesn't work, because Jesus was supposed to have been dead by that time. Because in the classical chronology, this Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me was in the 50s or 60s AD. So how was Jesus saying? They have to say that this is a disembodied spiritual Jesus who's sort of like, as it were, come back to life, and he's saying, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In my chronology, they were both alive at the same time, because Jesus of Gamala, the biblical Jesus, was the governor of Tiberias. He lived in Galilee, and he was being persecuted by Saul Josephus Flavius. And he writes all about it. He's chasing him all around Galilee until Josephus is so taken with his authority and his command. Remember, he was jailing the supporters of Jesus all across this region, persecuting them and putting them in prison, that the Judean authorities paid Jesus to go and capture Josephus, to turn the tables on this guy and go and capture him because he was out of control. He was him, as he says himself, he was aggrandizing himself to the point of glory. And so they paid Jesus an enormous amount of silver to go and capture him. So, yeah, they wouldn't have met until the AD 60s, would be the first time they met.
Lovely stuff. Thank you. Right. Time's ticking on, so we best keep moving. Our next question comes from Garrett Gallant. And he or she has asked, was John the Baptist a high priest in exile? Was he decapitated because he bent his knee to Jesus? And who was John the Baptist in relation to Isas Manu?
Okay, so I think we have to take this slightly more out of the sort of biblical type context. No, he was not in exile. He was very powerful. The reason some people think this is because John the Baptist is like a hermit in a cave. That's how he's portrayed, wearing animal skins. But remember that the high priest always wore an animal skin. The high priest of Egypt wore a leopard skin. And that, I think, is what John the Baptist was wearing. He was wearing a leopard skin, which was the sign of the high priest. If you look in the tomb of Tutankhamun, you will see I, who became Pharaoh I, wearing a leopard skin, because he was the Pharaoh and he was the high priest. So to wear an animal skin is not to be in exile. It means you're a high priest. So that the John the Baptist character was very important. And he was in effect the high priest and king, as it were, before Jesus became the high priest and king. So he wouldn't have been a king as such, because there was another king running around at that time, King Abgarus of Edessa. He would have been a prince, though, probably of this royal family, and I can sort of prove that. And then he was executed for about the marriage between Herodias and Antipas. The trouble was that, let's have a think about this. Herodias was married to Philip, who was one of the tetrarchs of Judea and Syria. But she fell in love with Antipas and married Antipas, or got together with Antipas. And Aretas, in order to do so, he had to send his other wife back to Petra, because he was married to a princess from Petra, which was ruled by King Aretas. And King Aretas was not happy with this, with his daughter being sent back. And so he sent an army up to punish Herod Antipas. And it was for this reason that John the Baptist was beheaded, because he complained about this marriage. He complained about the divorce of the daughter of Aretas, and he complained about the marriage of Herodias to Antipas, because she was already married to Herod Philip. And that shouldn't have happened. Now, this is good because it means that we have a history of these events. So you don't have to depend on the Gospels for this. We have an entire history from Josephus and from Moses of Corrine, who give us this information. And it dates this to about AD 33, because Herod Philip died in AD 35. So it must really have been before he had died. So we can date this pretty much to AD 33. It's nice when you get these little chronological pegs that you can put this on. So John the Baptist died beheaded in AD 33. But we know that that John the Baptist was linked to the Edessan royal family because we have two versions of this, and I think I've talked about this before, but I can go through it in just a couple of minutes. So Josephus says that Aretas from Petra made war with Herod Antipas, and when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed, by the treachery of some fugitives who were from the Tetrarchy of Philip, and they joined in with Aretas's army to defeat Herod Antipas. That's the trouble with Josephus, because he deletes one of the contingents in this army. He says the treachery of some fugitives. Who were these fugitives? Come on, Joseph, tell us the full story. Don't cover it up. But he's done this on purpose because he doesn't want you to know who was involved in this battle. And we have to go to Moses of Corine to get the answer. And he says of exactly the same events. He says, King Abgarus of Edessa allied himself with Aretas, king of Petra, and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated, thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Okay, this is real history now. This is not from the Gospels. So it's confirming that John the Baptist was a real person. John the Baptist was not in exile. He was not a pauper hermit sitting in a cave. He was obviously central to all of these events going on at the time. And the other thing is that the fugitives that Josephus talks about in his little account of this were the Edessan army. But Josephus never mentions the Edessans, and here we have a good illustration of what he does. He covers them up because he's not allowed to talk about the Edessans, because Vespasian told him not to talk about the Edessans. Why does he not talk about them? Because the Edessans were the leaders of the Jewish revolt, and Vespasian didn't want anyone talking about or venerating the Edessan royal family. So he just said to Josephus, look, delete them from your history. And he did. But Moses of Corine was not subject to those rules because he lived in Syria, and he was way behind the Council of Chalcedon, which divided East and West, and so he was safe, and he was behind the Iron Curtain of Islam, so again he was safe, and nobody could do anything about it. And the other thing about it is that he pointedly says that this was divine vengeance for the death of John the Baptist. Why were these combatants involved in this dispute? Well, Aretas, we know why he was involved, because his daughter had been spurned. But why were the Edessans involved? Well, they were involved because John the Baptist had been beheaded. This is prima facie evidence that John the Baptist was linked to this royal family. He was an Edessan prince. And I think from the Gospels, of course, he was supposed to be the cousin of Jesus. They were cousins. So even within the Gospel story, Jesus and John the Baptist were linked. And if Jesus was a prince of Edessa, therefore John the Baptist was a prince of Edessa. But he was just of the previous generation. So he was like an AD 30s character. And I say that the Jesus character did not come to prominence until the AD 50s and 60s. So Jesus would have been the younger of the two, presumably. John the Baptist would have done everything that Jesus did, but just like 30 years earlier or 40 years earlier.
So a cousin or possibly an uncle, maybe, if they were a
Well,
generation apart.
from the Gospels, they say cousin, but you can have cousins that are of different generations. So put it this way: my eldest uncle in our family, would you believe this? My eldest uncle died as a tank commander in the First World War.
Wow.
Not the Second World War. And he's an uncle. And he died as a tank commander in 1918. And that's an uncle.
Mm. Mm.
So any of his offspring, actually, I don't think he had any offspring. He was too young. He was probably about 18 or something. Um, they would have been a generation earlier than me, even though we would have been cousins. So if you have these long-lived families, like ours is a long-lived family. I mean, my grandfather had 14 children, so you can imagine they were strung out over many years. I think no, there were 12 children and 2 died. That's right. So there were 10 surviving. So they would have been strung out over an immense amount of time. And my father, of course, was the youngest of all of those. And the guy who died in the First World War was the oldest of all of those. So, yeah. So you can be of different generations.
Brilliant. That's a really interesting story, and it also um, adds more credence, I suppose, to your own theory and research. It really
To the
does.
Edessa theory, yes, it does, because you've got to ask yourself, why is Josephus deleting these people when he obviously knew who they were?
Mm.
And if John the Baptist was positively linked to Edessa by Moses of Corinne, who tells this story, then if John the Baptist was linked to Edessa, then surely the rest of the gospel story was linked as well.
Mm.
It sort of makes sense.
Yeah. Moses of Corinne is it easy to read? Is it quite a
Oh
one of
yes,
those?
yes.
Oh, it is quite
Oh
an
yeah.
easy
It's
book
it's
to
a
read.
it's not very long either. It's a very readable history. Um it's not even as complex as Josephus. It's a very easy read.
Mm.
And he gives the history of Edessa,
Mm.
because Moses, I suppose he was a Armenian, probably. I call him Syriac, but they were mixed together. So he was giving the history of his region, which was Armenia come northern Syria. And that's why he's interested in Edessa, because the Armenians regarded King Abgarus as one of their kings. They had this habit of saying someone else was their king. So if King Abgarus had taken over Armenia for a while, they said, "Oh, well, he's just our king." And they did the same with the Parthians. When the Parthians conquered Armenia, they just said, "Oh, our king is the Parthian king," and they claimed him as being their own. It's one way of doing it, I suppose, isn't it? And therefore they wrote the history of these various kings of Parthia and Edessa.
Mm. Great. Okay. Next question comes from Emil Mandrew. And Emil was asked, what does it say about Izate's Manu from the Chronicle of Zuknin?
Oh
As far as
yes.
is it just you've got some death dates of the Edessan kings? Is there any more detail than that?
No, unfortunately, the Chronicle of Zuknin is very limited in this early era. It gives some information about the later centuries in Edessa, but the early era, it's just a king list more than anything else. So I do quote it, and the problem, as it were, is that the Chronicle of Zuknin gives a history of Edessa that goes back 160 years before the first century. Which, well, it's not actually a problem, because you could easily say that the Abgar V took over this region and just assumed the position as the next king, and therefore became the king of Edessa from the beginning of the first century. However, I still think that is not the case, even though the Chronicle of Zuknin mentions previous kings of the region, because Moses of Corinne and Michael the Syrian disagree with that. And they say, so a couple of little quotes here, they won't take very long. Moses of Corinne says, King Abgarus formed and planned for a revolt against Germanicus, that's Caligula, and prepared for combat. He built a town on the grounds of an Armenian observation camp, and this new town was called Edessa. Abgar took his royal court and all of his god's books, archives, and his temple schools to that city, which had been at Medzipine. So he is saying that Edessa was established by Abgar V in the 1st century. And before that, it had only been like a small town and an army camp, basically. It had not been a principality. And if it wasn't a principality, it's hardly likely to have had any kings. So is that king list correct or not? And Michael the Syrian says the same. He says, in the region which is called the Osrone, that's where Edessa is, of course, the race of those who lived in Edessa had dwindled. When no one was found there of the Greek race to arise and maintain the honor of the kingdom of the Greeks in Syria, the Armenians appointed someone from their own midst, and his name was Abgar V. Okay, so I don't know. The history seems to indicate that Edessa was founded in the 1st century BC, and before that it had only been a village or a town. So is the Chronicle of Zuknin correct? I don't know. But it doesn't give a chronicle, it only gives a king list. So there's no real information of these early kings. But certainly Abgar V was the primary king who turned this region into an independent principality and formed the Edessan monarchy as we know it.
Michael the Syrian, that's a name I haven't come across before.
Yeah, they have these chroniclers from this region, which people don't read very much because they detail events in the East. They don't detail events in, Rome or Judea so much. But yeah, I mean, they're as valid as any other chroniclers from this era. I mean, there are some researchers, in fact, sort of some of my critics who say, why are you using Moses of Chorene? Well, there's no real difference between using Moses of Chorene and using Josephus Flavius. They're sort of two peas in the pod in terms of being trustworthy for recording the history of this region. And we know that Moses of Chorene is relatively reliable because he gives, in many instances, the same information that Josephus gives. And so he's corroborating what Josephus has said, but he's obviously taking his texts from a different source. He's not just copying Josephus. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known about the Edessans and the army of Aretas. So he's giving different information from different sources to Josephus Flavius, which is great because now you can back up what Josephus Flavius says and get two perspectives on the same event. And hopefully from those two different perspectives, you can discover the truth of what's being said. So I think Moses of Chorene is quite a good historian. So.
I would have to agree with that, definitely. We could do a whole separate video on that question, probably. Yes. But as I'm a bit wary of the time, we best move on. But that was fascinating. Thank you for the question, Emil. Our penultimate question for today comes from Mark Konzarowski. Hope I pronounced that correctly. And they have asked you, where is there to go with the Grail story past the Middle Ages? Does it have a place in succeeding ages?
Sorry, can you just read that one again? Because I didn't catch it.
So, where is there to go with the Grail story past the Middle Ages? Does it have a place in succeeding ages?
Again, we probably don't have enough information. So the Grail stone disappears from recorded history at the time of Elagabalus. So that's about 220, 225 AD or so, when Emperor Elagabalus was murdered in Rome. And the sacred stone then goes missing, and we have no record of it after that, except we get these stories from the Templars and the Crusaders after they'd been on the Crusades. So I suppose the question is, did the Templars find this sacred stone? The Holy Grail being the sacred stone. Within Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail is said to be the sacred Omphale stone, which I detail the history of as it goes around Greece and Parthia and back to Syria and so on. Then it went to Rome with Emperor Elagabalus, and then it goes missing. So did they find this stone, or did they just find a history of this stone? We don't really know. And could it be important in the modern era? Well, not if it is what they sort of describe it being. So they describe it as being basically a meteorite, possibly a magnetic meteorite, which must have been fascinating in early eras, of course, because nobody understood magnetism. It was a very eerie force, which if you took a piece of metal close to the stone, it would take it out of your hands with this invisible force. It's like God would just reach out and grab something out of your hand and stick it onto this Holy Grail meteorite. Now, in the modern era, of course, that's fully understandable. So it's not going to be a sacred item in the modern era.
Sorry, Ralph. This reminds me of the sword of Excalibur.
Yes,
There's a connection here, isn't there?
It could be the source of the sword in the stone story. So yes, how did a sword get stuck into a stone? Well, if it was magnetic, of course it would. It could quite easily get stuck on a stone. And that might be the source of the sword in the stone legend. But of course, the legend goes on and says that Arthur didn't have a problem with it and he could withdraw his sword. And the answer to that little conundrum, of course, is that Arthur had a bronze sword. Now, most people wouldn't know the difference, but bronze does not get stuck on a magnet, of course. So Arthur could put his sword on the sacred stone and withdraw it very easily. But one of the other knights would get his iron sword stone. It could be the source of that sort of legend, because they did know about magnetism. Arthurian legend talks about the magnetic islands. The floating islands of the Mediterranean were supposed to be magnetic, and therefore they turned with the earth as the earth rotated. Or in fact, I think it says as the heavens above rotated. And it turned the floating island via magnetism. So they were sort of familiar with the effects of magnets, because ever since the Viking Age, apparently they'd use them as compasses. So they knew how to magnetize, a piece of metal and use it as a compass. So, and even back in the 1st century, there was stories about Hero of Alexandria using magnets to amaze the aristocracy even back then. Apparently he could make a chariot fly via a magnet or something. So, yeah, all these sort of strange little stories. So where did it go to? We still have this history from the Knights Templar in Scotland. We have a Templar society up in Scotland who claims a tradition going back to the Knights Templars, because apparently the Knights Templars, when they were we had the dissolution of the Knights Templar in 1307, when they were captured by the Catholic Church, apparently a lot of them fled to Scotland. And so we have this Templar contingent up in Scotland. and they were linked with the Sanclairs who are linked to, the Holy Blood, Holy Grail story, all of that sort
They're
of
they're
business.
supposed to be a very powerful family to this day, aren't they, the Sinclairs?
Yes. Yeah, the
Mm,
Sinclairs are. They were supposed to have, sailed to America in long before Christopher Columbus and all of that sort of stuff. They were supposed to be responsible for the Roslin Chapel and things of that nature. Um, Now, the Sinclairs were supposed to be um, guardians of the Grail, as it were, of the holy of this Grail stone, the Omphalos stone, and it's supposed to be up in Scotland. So I was up there, and I went to a Templar Lodge meeting there up at Roslin, and they claimed that they still have it, but they didn't provide any evidence for that. All they gave me was a video, which was just a CGI video. It wasn't real at all. So, but they were suggesting that the sacred stone could levitate, and so they had this CGI little video of it levitating itself. Yeah, well, but there's no evidence.
mm,
It would be nice if I could actually see it.
yeah.
Just saying, here it is, believe what the video
Mm.
says is not really evidence. And then they had it looking more like a curling stone. So the omphalos is supposed to be a domed shape. It's supposed to be like a pyramidion. Um, as you can see, in my books, I got various pictures of it because we know what it's supposed to have looked like because we have coins in Rome and coins in Syria with the Elagabal on it, and it's a sort of domed sort of shape, not very big. It's probably less than 2 foot high, less than 60 centimeters. And in a recent posting I've put on my Facebook page, I link it up with the lingams of India because I've come across some verses about Jacob's pillar, which directly link Jacob's pillar with the lingams in India. So that's interesting. I'm going to flesh that
Mm.
out shortly.
Yeah, many of these very ancient Indian temples have these lingams, don't they?
Mm,
Um, there's a guy, we were talking off camera actually, there's a guy on YouTube called Praveen Mohan
mm,
who goes around all of India examining a lot of ancient Indian temples, architecture. Does a fantastic job, and there's a lot of stuff to be seen in India on this front.
mm.
Definitely, very very interesting.
I didn't realize that they were so closely linked, but Jacob with his pillow. So this is the verses about Jacob's pillow. Um, Jacob's pillow, because that never makes any sense. Why was he using a pillow made of stone? I mean, who would? But the pillow can be translated as an altar. And so he was setting up his pillar on an altar, not on a pillow. And then he got up early in the morning to baste it with oils. But of course, if you go to a Hindu temple, that's exactly what they do to their lingams. So early in the morning, they get up and they baste their lingam, which is a sacred stone that looks exactly like the Elagabal, a sort of domed small stone, small stone, a couple of feet high, and they baste them with oil in the morning in exactly the same fashion as Jacob did at Beersheba. And it just struck me that this is exactly the same story. So there is a direct connection there between the Old Testament and Hinduism. And of course, there would be some links, not necessarily at that time, well, possibly at that time, but later on, because we have stories of the Edessan monarchy, some of them going to India. We have this story from the Doctrine of Addai and various others. And I'm also looking at a church that I've just discovered. I'm talking with a lady, Sarah is her name, who is one of the administrators for the Edessan church in India, which I did not know existed. And I've suddenly just found this Edessan church in India. which was populated in AD 51, would you believe, by some Edessans.
Wow, AD 51.
So they say. Yeah. Well, Thomas, it's part of the
So
doctrine
while
of Adai.
Yeah, so while Isas was still alive, in other words, which is that's
Yes.
very,
Yes.
very interesting.
Yeah. Very
I think
early.
I've mentioned to you before, back in the 80s, I think it was written in the 70s. I was reading a book called Jesus Lived in India.
Mm,
I think it was written by a German author. I can't remember his name now. But since the book came out, a lot of people have said that it was Jesus's brother that
mm.
lived in it or moved to India and lived out there for a long time. Possibly Judas.
Yeah. Judas was his twin brother.
Hmm.
So Judas was called Thomas Didymus, which means Judas the twin. Twin. So
So
yeah, he was regarded as being the twin brother of Jesus. Was called
so
Judas.
possibly this is the guy that may have founded that church you're just referring to.
Yeah. There were quite a few people were saying Jesus went to India.
Hmm.
And I used to follow a lady on Facebook who had been up in Kashmir, living in Kashmir, because she thought Jesus had gone to Kashmir. But the books I've read, well, books, the manuscripts I've read, all tend to say that it was Judas that went there.
Right.
Judas Thomas Didymus, Thaddeus, and it was from Thaddeus that we get Adai. It's a derivation of Thaddeus, and that he went
Hmm.
to India. But I didn't realize, having done all of that research on this, and I do this in my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, but even having done that research, I didn't know there was an Edessan church in India. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I'll have to do a little write up on that.
Fascinating.
I've ordered a book on their records, but she says that the records are a little bit fragmentary, which you can imagine. I mean, this is like, 2,000 years ago.
Hmm.
But they do have a book that details the history of the church.
Wow.
And it was supposed to be established by Thomas. And obviously, Thomas must be Judas Thomas Didymus.
Hmm.
Well, that's what they believe anyway. But there's no reason why not, because there are several manuscripts that do point in that sort of direction in that
Hmm.
region.
Hmm.
And
I
then we
think
have
there's.
this link with the Lingams as well. So,
Hmm. I was going to say, I think there's a lot to be gleaned from India. I think I'm sure there's been people before the guy that I mentioned, Praveen Mohan, who's been
mm,
going around India and uncovering a lot of stuff. But in terms with regards to ancient history, there's a lot to be discovered with India. I think I really
mm.
do think that.
But,
Okay,
but
so
the interesting thing is, I didn't know there was quite such a connection between Hinduism and ancient Judaism.
hmm,
But if Jacob, who's one of the prime patriarchs, of course, of Judaism, if he was performing a rite, and this would have been back in my chronology, the Jacob character would have been like 1700 BC, an awful long time ago, 3,700 years ago, performing a rite which is identical to modern Hinduism. And I didn't know that there was that close connection between Judaism and Hinduism, that they have the same rituals.
hmm,
So yeah, that's interesting. It's a whole new area of research, really.
hmm. Fascinating. Right.
And we only found that 2 days ago. I
Yeah.
did it live on radio. I was doing a talk like this one with a YouTuber, and he asked this question, and we went through this verse, and we discovered this actually on live on air, as it were. So interesting.
Brilliant. Maybe I could link that particular video underneath this one. I'd
Yes, yeah,
mind
possibly.
seeing that myself. Right. Are we ready for the very last question of the
Yes,
day?
let's go for
It's come from Steve Kavanagh, who incidentally his band have an album out. I promised I'd mention this. Zendad of the band. It's very, very good. And his question is, what do you think would have happened if King Isas Manu had been successful in the Jewish revolt, and how different would the world be today? That's a question. Wow.
it.
We're
It
both.
is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because yes, the world turns on a dime, doesn't it? A few pivotal events can change the course of history. My horse, my kingdom for a horse, and suddenly the battle is lost and someone else takes over as the new king. Yes, and the same happened. We had this battle, and as readers and listeners will know, I say that Jesus was the leader of the Jewish revolt, and the whole purpose of the Jewish revolt was to take over the throne of Rome, because the throne of Rome was empty. And so if he had won that battle against Vespasian, he would have become the next emperor of Rome. And the entire history of Rome and the Western world may well have changed completely at that point. And so what would it have been like if he had become the next emperor? Good and bad, I would say. The bad is that he was, in modern terms, you would call it racist, because his church was only for the Jews. He was not opening up that church to other Gentiles from around the Roman Empire. So it would have been very difficult for him to rule as an emperor when he was not including the whole of the peoples within that empire and favoring only the Jews, and not even just the Jews, but only the sort of Nazarene type Jews. So he was, his audience would have been a very select few within the empire. And that would have made it very difficult to rule, I think. Whereas it was Saul, the Saul Josephus character, who opened up Judaism to the entire Roman Empire. He was teaching to the Gentiles. He became the apostle to the Gentiles. He created Christianity. And that's why Christianity, in some senses, was a much better vehicle to allow the Roman Empire to expand and become influential, which it sort of did later on, because the Roman Empire turned into the Catholic Church. They are one and the same thing. The emperors became the popes, and the popes are just the heirs to the throne of Rome. So that's the downside, and I don't know how that would have played out if he was just promoting the Nazarene Jews and not the whole of the Roman Empire. The good side was they had a Gnostic side to them, a scientific side, which the Catholic Church did not, because the Saul Josephus character had never been initiated into the mysteries of the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. And so they didn't know any of these scientific things, which is why the Catholic Church ended up as being anti-scientific. They knew nothing about the zodiac. They knew nothing about the mathematics that they held within the Nazarene Church. And that's why the zodiac and all of these other elements from Egyptian Gnosticism, which was a part and parcel of the Church of Jesus and James, never went through into the Catholic Church. And so for the Catholics, that the zodiac and Egypt and the pyramids and all of that sort of side of the Nazarene Church became taboo. It became anti-science, whereas the Church of Jesus and James was pro-science. And so if the Jesus character became Emperor of Rome, and remember the Jesus character was a patron of Hero of Alexandria, that's where he got his water to wine jug for turning water to wine at the wedding at Cana. That jug came from Hieron of Alexandria. So quite obviously, the Jesus character was a patron of Hieron of Alexandria, who was the foremost scientist, as it were, in the first century. Then science would have progressed much, much quicker under the rule of Jesus and James than it did under sort of the later Catholic Church. So it's possible, if that had continued, we could have had the first man on the moon in the 4th century. And that would have been like 1600 years ago. Man would have been on, the Apollo program would have been in the 4th century. And where would we have been now? I don't know. We could be, we could have had outposts on the moons of Jupiter or something, by now.
Provided, of course, they hadn't have lost the technology shortly afterwards.
Well, that's true. I mean, especially with nuclear power being such a danger, you can invent it and destroy yourself all within 50 years. Yes, it's difficult to know how that would have panned out. It's a very intriguing question because there are so many pros and cons with the Church of Jesus and James. Would it have been successful? I suppose you could say you could actually do a comparison with the Knights Templar to see how successful they were, because the Knights Templar were the successors to the Church of Jesus and James. They had the same constitution. They had the same society. So it was communist in exactly the same way that the Church of Jesus and James was communist. You had to give up all of your wealth to the church, both within Templar Church and the Church of Jesus and James. So you would then have to deal with the politics of communism. Would that have lasted as a political, social system in order to generate the wealth that's required for the science and technology? I don't know, because in general, communism doesn't work in the long term because it doesn't give sufficient incentive for people to work. And we've talked about this before, but people are intrinsically lazy. You have to give some sort of incentive for people to go out and work, especially if you're doing very difficult work, working down a mine, or you're doing shift work, or, one of the more dangerous jobs around the world. You have to have an incentive to go out and do that. And communism quite often does not give that sort of incentive to work. It's great in the initial stages because people are full of zeal, whether it's the sort of atheist zeal of the Russian communism, or whether it's the religious zeal of the kibbutzniks when they set up the kibbutzes in Israel in the 1950s, because the kibbutz system is completely communist, and it was based upon the communism within Judaism, just like the Church of Jesus and James was communist in exactly the same fashion. And of course, the kibbutzes were very, very successful. They were very rich in the early era, was producing all of the agriculture for Israel. But in later years, they all collapsed because the people grew richer. It was great when they were all poor. When you're all poor together and you're together in the same rooms and you're eating in the same eating house, as when I spent 6 months on a kibbutz doing exactly the same thing. And everything is communal. There is no money on a kibbutz. Everything is essentially free. But that only works when people don't have very much to share. When people started getting wealthier, and of course now everyone is owning televisions and cars and all of the other trinkets of a wealthy lifestyle, suddenly the people in the kibbutz all wanted those extra trinkets, which now people in the towns and cities were all getting. Well, I want my own car. Well, you can't have one. This is a kibbutz. Yeah, but I want a car. No, you can't have a car. And suddenly there were tensions within this kibbutz system, and they all failed. And so eventually they all became farmers' cooperatives. So independent farmers with their own finances working together within a cooperative and sharing the main equipment which is too expensive for a single person to actually go out and buy. And so they all changed. The communist system of the kibbutz actually failed. The communist system of Russia failed. The communist system of Cuba failed. It just doesn't work. The communist system of North Korea is failing. It doesn't provide the goods for its people because it's a failed system. It doesn't provide any incentive to go out to work. The communist system of China failed until they had capitalism. And suddenly the Chinese people became the most productive people in the whole world when they ditched communism and became capitalist. So taking that back to the Templars and to the Church of Jesus and James, if they had been in charge of Rome, the Templars worked because they were always getting new recruits. It's like a pyramid scheme. It's fine as long as you have people joining at the bottom. When you no longer have anyone joining at the bottom, the pyramid scheme falls over and it dies, it collapses. I get the impression the same would have happened in Rome if they had tried to implement that system, because Rome was essentially capitalist. The only communist, as it were, elements within it were really the army. Well, even that was capitalist, I suppose, but that was the only thing the government actually had to subsidize and pay for. So your Roman taxes went for games and things of that nature, you know, the Colosseums and whatever, and the army. And that was about it, really. That's all. I suppose elements of the road system were run by the government as well. The aqueducts, I suppose, they were run either by subscriptions by wealthy people or by the government itself. I think we spoke about this before, where Rome did have a number of very wealthy patrons who paid for some of these very expensive items, like aqueducts. And so some of these, they weren't private aqueducts, but they were actually paid for by wealthy people. And of course, those wealthy people would put their name on them and therefore derive power and influence because they were linked to these, you know, public infrastructure projects. So people would know that, you know, John Smith provided this particular aqueduct. So long term in Rome, would the communist system have worked? I don't think it would. I think it would have collapsed. And so they would have evolved their system, you know, the Church of Jesus and James system. They would have had to evolve themselves into a more free market capitalist system in order to survive. Otherwise, the whole thing would have collapsed, I think.
Well, fascinating. Thanks for that question, Steve. That's really good, and that was a great answer. I really enjoyed that.
Food for thought. I'm sure actually that will generate a lot of comments on the video, because it's still a hot topic today. You know, never mind Rome or the Templars or anyone else. It's still a hot topic today. The whole of America is consumed by this battle between the communists and the capitalists, because the Democrat Party has changed into a pseudo-communist party, supporting communist ideals left, right, and center. And of course, the Republicans hate that. And so you've got this open warfare between these two political sides as to which will win. And it'll be interesting to see which does win, actually.
It will, and but it does make a change from the politics that go on in a lot of other countries, because, you know, left and right these days, generally, or maybe up until recently, we're getting closer and closer and closer. You know,
They
and
were.
now we have Trump, well, hopefully Trump coming back, and Biden. So
Yeah,
you get,
it's funny that happened, isn't it? They were all going centrist in many parts of the world. They were
yeah,
going centrist, and
mm,
we'd left behind, the struggles, the class struggles of the 1960s and 70s and so on in Britain and various other places, and the race struggles that they had in America. We didn't have any of that in Britain at that time, and everything was going more centrist. And now it's diverging and all going to the extremes again. And you think, why did that happen? I don't think it's a good move, by the way. I think the world was much better when it was centrist.
I suppose you could be right. Yeah, you probably are right there. It certainly makes for good political theatre, shall we say? Anyway,
It
uh,
does.
yeah. Okay, really.
Yes.
Yeah. Should we
So
stop there?
comments below, people. Let's have a discussion on this in the comments,
Mm,
because I do turn up on these comments and I make comments, and at least for the first couple of weeks after a video is released, I'll be on there and I'll look at the comments and make answers. So
brilliant.
yeah, put
We've
your
also
point of view.
we've also done a video on wokeism called Deception and Dishonesty, or Dishonesty and Deception, one of
Mm,
the two anyway. And that's really worth looking at. Ralph
yes,
really does break down wokeism, stroke Marxism, really, really well. So look out for that. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for sharing your
pleasure.
knowledge and research with us. Thank you so much to Sam, Lisa, Justin, Name, Jeff, Dachow55, Garrett, Emil, Mark, and Steve. I really, really enjoyed that, and the questions were absolutely fantastic. So we may do another one. I don't know. When are you going to Egypt, Ralph?
Not till beginning of October.
Okay, so we've got maybe 4 weeks. Maybe
Mm.
we could squeeze in one more before you go,
Oh, I
if you
think we
didn't
could.
mind.
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes.
look out for that, everyone. Please like, share, subscribe as always. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Paul.
Cheers. Bye.